Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Picture this. It is the weekend of April 18th and 19th, 2026.
Right.
The President of the United States has just signed a bill to save a massively controversial surveillance law from expiring.
Literally at the last possible second.
Exactly. But here is the massive catch. It is not a permanent fix. It's not even like a multi-year reauthorization. It is a 10-day Band-Aid.
A 10-day Band-Aid for a massive national security law. It's wild.
It really is. So today we are taking a stack of reporting from the BBC and CBS News to figure out exactly why Washington just hit this spectacular bipartisan border wall over FISA Section 702.
And, why a desperate 11th hour 10-day extension was literally the only way to keep the lights on.
Right. And just a really quick heads up for you before we dive in, the rhetoric around this issue gets incredibly heated on both sides of the aisle.
Oh, absolutely.
So we aren't here to pick a side or, endorse any political viewpoints. We are strictly here to impartially break down the mechanics of how this massive political pileup happened.
Yeah, just sticking to the facts and the quotes from our sources.
Exactly. So just looking at the sheer mechanics of a 10-day extension in legislative time.
I mean, it's fascinating. 10 days is barely enough time to, print a new draft of a bill, let alone negotiate a deeply entrenched constitutional standoff.
Right?
It's essentially a pressure cooker designed to force lawmakers into a crisis.
And to understand why Congress was forced to set that 10-day timer, we really need to look at the engine of the controversy itself, which is Section 702.
Yeah, we have to go back a bit.
Right, because we all know the broader FISA framework, which was established way back in 1978 to regulate foreign intelligence gathering.
Right, so the old way was, if the government wants to monitor a foreign target, they go to the specialized FISA court, and they get an order compelling U.S. telecom companies to assist.
But the digital age completely changed the physical reality of how global communication actually works, which, led Congress to add Section 702 in 2008.
Yeah, and the addition of Section 702 shifted the entire operational landscape.
How?
Well, instead of requiring an individualized warrant for every single foreign target, Section 702 basically gives the NSA and the FBI the authority to collect the communications of non-citizens located outside the U.S.
And they can just draw that directly from U.S. digital infrastructure, right?
Exactly, without a traditional search warrant. The programmatic approval from the FISA court essentially allows the intelligence community to compel major American tech and telecommunications companies to just hand over massive streams of data originating from foreign targets.
Okay, let's unpack this. Think of it like this. The government is casting this giant, warrantless fishing net into the ocean.
I like that analogy.
Right. And their legally stated goal is to catch foreign tuna, those non-citizens located overseas.
Right.
And the net is vast because global data routing is vast. But the core problem driving this current legislative meltdown is that while they are dragging this massive net through the digital ocean, they keep scooping up American dolphins as bycatch.
Yes, the bycatch. What's fascinating here is how our sources frame this exact issue, because it reveals the absolute polarization of the debate.
Right, because they are sweeping up the text messages, emails, and phone records of everyday Americans who just happen to be communicating with or even just mentioned by those targeted foreigners.
Exactly. And the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, looks at this mechanism and labels it, quote, mass warrantless surveillance of Americans and foreigners' phone calls, text messages, emails, and other electronic communications.
That's a strong label.
It is, and the focal point of their alarm. And honestly, the sticking point for lawmakers on both the far left and the far right is what they term the backdoor search loophole.
I want to break down how that backdoor search actually functions because the mechanics of it are what make it so controversial.
Yeah, let's do it.
So if your data gets scooped up as bycatch, it just sits in a massive government database. And the fear the ACLU and these lawmakers highlight is that a domestic law enforcement agent, say someone at the FBI, can just sit at a terminal and type in an American citizen's name or email address to search that database for domestic criminal investigations.
Without ever going to a judge.
Exactly. They can do that without ever getting a warrant, effectively bypassing the Fourth Amendment by searching data that was originally collected under a foreign intelligence mandate.
And that's why the critics argue that this loophole allows the government to prosecute and imprison Americans for crimes that have absolutely nothing to do with national security.
But then you have the defenders of the law.
Right, primarily national security officials.
Mm.
They argue that Section 702 is like the most vital tool in their arsenal.
Yeah, they really do.
They credit this specific data collection with the disruption of active terrorist plots, stopping foreign espionage, dismantling international drug trafficking rings.
And preventing massive cyber intrusions before they cripple American infrastructure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The NSA's argument here is all about speed and connection. They state their goal is to, quote, connect the dots between foreign-based actors and their activities in the U.S.
They want to see if the foreign tuna is talking to a domestic dolphin, just to stick with our analogy.
Right.
But I have to push back on the constitutional logic here, just looking at the arguments. If the Fourth Amendment protects Americans from unreasonable search and seizure, how does law enforcement logically justify querying a database for an American's communications without securing a warrant for that specific search?
So the intelligence community's defense rests heavily on the mechanics of time and how you actually define a search.
Okay.
They argue that the data was legally collected in the first place because the target was foreign.
Right.
So requiring an FBI agent to halt an active, fast-moving investigation, draft a probable cause affidavit, and then wait for a judge to approve a warrant just to search a database the government already legally possesses.
They think that would be too slow.
Exactly. They argue it would slow down operations to a dangerous degree. Furthermore, they emphasize that they often run these queries not to prosecute criminals, but to identify potential American victims of foreign cyber attacks or espionage.
Like warning them that they're being targeted?
Yes, they argue a warrant requirement would blind them to domestic threats until it is way too late.
And because the intelligence community refuses to surrender that speed, and the privacy advocates absolutely refuse to budge on the Fourth Amendment warrant requirement, House Speaker Mike Johnson was trapped.
Completely boxed in.
He had no middle ground, which is what triggered the complete legislative meltdown we saw last week.
Yeah, the timeline here is crazy.
Right, the law was set to expire on Monday, April 20th. House Republican leaders had deliberately delayed floor action until the very week of expiration, hoping the ticking clock would just force a consensus.
Which is a standard legislative tactic, relying on the pressure of a deadline. But in this case, it spectacularly backfired.
Why do you think it failed so badly this time?
Because the opposition to Section 702 doesn't follow traditional party lines.
Ah, right.
You have progressive Democrats who are focused on civil liberties and government overreach, and they are aligning perfectly with conservative Republicans who cite a really deep distrust of federal law enforcement agencies.
A rare moment of bipartisan agreement.
Truly. And both factions demanded strict warrant requirements to protect Americans' privacy.
And so Speaker Johnson is staring down this bipartisan coalition with the clock just running out.
Tick-tock.
Right. So after midnight on Thursday, going into the early hours of Friday, he tries his first major maneuver.
Okay.
He proposes a 5-year extension of Section 702.
But he needs to win over the skeptics.
Exactly. So to do that, he attaches some modest reforms, including enhanced criminal penalties for any government official caught misusing the surveillance program.
The strategy behind that 5-year pitch was clearly to offer just enough accountability to satisfy the moderates while keeping the core functionality of the database queries intact for the intelligence community.
Right, but the enhanced criminal penalties didn't actually change the physical mechanism of the backdoor search.
Not at all.
So a dozen Republicans looked at that proposal, saw that it lacked a hard warrant requirement for domestic queries, and they just blocked it from moving forward.
12 members of his own party shut down a 5-year compromise.
So Johnson immediately pivots. If they won't accept a long-term deal with modest reforms, he attempts to push through a shorter 18-month clean renewal.
And by clean, we mean zero reforms.
Zero. It keeps the law exactly as it currently operates, pushing the expiration date a year and a half down the road, conveniently past the next election cycle.
But that 18-month maneuver is where the floor dynamics really unraveled.
Oh, completely.
Because pushing a clean renewal when your own party is actively demanding reforms is a massive, massive gamble.
And he lost that gamble. 20 Republicans revolted and blocked the 18-month extension.
20.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They wielded their procedural leverage to completely freeze the House floor. They refused to even give him a year and a half of the status quo.
The sheer dysfunction of this sequence is staggering, if you think about it.
I mean, a 5-year extension fails. An 18-month extension fails. The Speaker of the House is handed back-to-back, deeply embarrassing defeats in the middle of the night.
Yeah, with a Monday expiration date looming.
So the House resorts to an act of pure desperation. After 2 a.m., they pass an extension of just 10 days via unanimous consent.
Which is wild. Unanimous consent at 2 a.m. is essentially the legislative equivalent of pulling the fire alarm.
Right, because it requires every single member present to agree to move the measure forward without a formal recorded vote.
It only succeeded because literally nobody wanted to be the single individual responsible for letting the entire foreign intelligence apparatus go dark on a Monday morning.
But passing it in the House just created a completely new mechanical crisis in the Senate.
Oh, yeah, because by the time the House finally passes this tiny 10-day Band-Aid in the early hours of Friday, most of the senators had already left Washington.
They looked at the chaos in the House on Thursday, assumed a deal was impossible, and just went home for the weekend.
Exactly. So the Senate has to scramble later Friday morning just to pass this 10-day stopgap and pause the countdown clock.
It's unbelievable. What does it say about this law that lawmakers are so fiercely divided that they couldn't even compromise on a modest reform package?
Well, the necessity of a 10-day extension tells us that the backdoor search loophole has really evolved from, a fringe concern into a hard line in the sand for a massive voting bloc in Congress.
Right.
Senate Majority Leader John Thune noted that reforming the bill is a possibility during this 10-day window, but he deliberately made no guarantees.
Because it's such a mess.
Yeah, this 10-day punt doesn't solve the problem. It just shifts the cliff edge to April 30th to buy time for backdoor negotiations because the foundational trust in how this tool is utilized domestically is just totally broken.
We really need to look at why Speaker Johnson even attempted that doomed 18-month clean renewal in the first place, knowing his own party was threatening a revolt.
There's always a reason.
And the answer lies in the immense pressure radiating from the Oval Office.
Oh, right.
The Trump administration was aggressively strong-arming Republicans to accept that 18-month reform-free reauthorization.
And the Trump administration's aggressive push for a clean renewal is a dizzying pivot when you look at the recent historical context.
It really is.
As our sources from the BBC detail, President Trump has historically been one of the most vocal, high-profile critics of FISA.
Yeah, he has repeatedly contended that he was, quote, a victim of the worst and most illegal abuse of FISA in U.S. history.
Right. He has specifically cited his 2016 presidential campaign against Hillary Clinton and his 2020 campaign against Joe Biden,
loudly arguing to his political base that these exact surveillance tools were corrupt and weaponized against him.
And his conservative allies in Congress really internalized that message.
Which is exactly why they were standing on the House floor demanding strict warrant requirements to stop the government from spying on American citizens.
But the whiplash occurred this week. Despite years of claiming the system was abused to target him, President Trump dramatically softened his stance.
Right. On Tuesday, he posted on social media explicitly calling for the bill to be extended without any reforms.
You just abandoned the demand for warrants and demanded the 18-month clean renewal.
And the reasoning he provided for that sudden reversal is so critical to understand here.
What did he say?
He stated that the U.S. military desperately needed Section 702 to succeed on the battlefield, and he pointed specifically to the wake of U.S. operations in Venezuela and Iran.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he is arguing that the military physically requires this intelligence-gathering tool to maintain visibility in active, hostile foreign theaters.
This creates such an incredible tension. I mean, you have a political leader who spent years claiming a law was illegally used against him domestically, now pivoting to say the macro-level foreign intelligence value overrides the micro-level domestic concerns. And he punctuated this shift with a really striking quote posted on Wednesday. He said, quote, "I am willing to risk the giving up of my rights and privileges as a citizen for our great military and country."
Giving up of my rights and privileges as a citizen.
Yeah.
I mean, that is an astonishing public statement from a president. It shifts the entire framework of the debate.
He really does.
He is no longer arguing that the surveillance law is safe or that the privacy concerns are overblown. He is openly acknowledging the risk to individual constitutional rights and stating that he is willingly sacrificing them for military advantage.
Right.
How does a statement like that actively alter the calculus for those bipartisan lawmakers who are freezing the House floor over privacy reforms?
Well, that quote perfectly distills the terrible dilemma at the heart of Section 702, and it illustrates exactly why the law is nearly impossible to kill or significantly reform.
Because of the military aspect.
Exactly. It forces every single lawmaker to weigh an abstract domestic threat against an immediate, tangible foreign threat.
Right.
Even the most fiercely dedicated civil liberties advocates often flinch when intelligence directors and military generals brief them on active operations in places like Iran or Venezuela.
Because the military argument is essentially, If you mandate a warrant requirement that slows down our data queries, you are blinding us to imminent threats in hostile territory, and American lives will be lost.
That is the ultimate leverage.
It really is.
The Trump administration used the weight of those active military operations to try and force the GOP holdouts to abandon their privacy demands and accept the clean renewal.
But the events of early Friday morning prove that the strategy completely failed.
Yeah, it wasn't enough.
The anxiety over warrantless domestic surveillance has grown so deeply rooted in the legislative branch that even the president explicitly asking his party to sacrifice their rights for the military wasn't enough to secure anything more than a 10-day reprieve.
The leverage of the Oval Office collided with the leverage of the House holdouts, resulting in just a total deadlock.
Which leaves us looking at the reality of this 10-day Band-Aid. We have a surveillance framework rooted in the Cold War, aggressively expanded for the digital age, and it is currently clinging to life by a literal thread.
A very thin thread.
And what this means for you listening right now is that the digital infrastructure you rely on daily, your emails, your texts, your online footprint, is the prize in a massive, unresolved tug of war.
That's a great way to put it.
On one end of the rope is the undeniable necessity of fighting global terrorism, international drug cartels, and state-sponsored cyber intrusions.
Very real threats.
Very real. But on the other end is the fundamental constitutional protection of your data from unwarranted government search. And Washington only bought themselves until April 30th to figure out how to balance those two massive forces.
And, the mechanics of this 10-day extension raise a really critical question, one that honestly isn't explicitly answered in the reporting, but definitely hangs over the entire debate as April 30th approaches.
What's that?
If a surveillance tool designed legally and strictly to target foreign threats constantly sweeps up such a vast amount of American data that lawmakers from every corner of the political spectrum considered it a primary domestic privacy threat.
Right.
At what point does the bycatch cease to be an accident? At what point does the backdoor loophole actually become a primary function of the law?
That is the exact fear driving the gridlock. And, the secondary terror is what happens to our global intelligence visibility if they can't break this deadlock by May 1st.
Right, because if this 10-day timer runs out without a compromise, the government just loses the authority to compel the tech companies.
The data stream goes dark and the net is pulled from the ocean entirely.
Exactly.
It really leaves you wondering what Washington will decide in the next 10 days. Do they find a way to let the dolphins go, or do they decide the tuna is worth keeping both?
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.